You're listening to The Inquiry with me, Helena Merriman. It's my last show for a little while as I'm going off to have a baby. And as a parting gift, the Inquiry team have allowed me to make a programme about something that's always fascinated me. And, hopefully, you too. Here's a clue. Got it? If not, maybe this will help. That's right, we're going off in search of extraterrestrial life, asking one of the biggest and most exciting questions of all time. Is anyone out there?
Part 1. Salad-winged horses.
I think we're obsessed with extraterrestrial life because we ultimately can't bear the thought that we're alone in the universe.
Meet Natalie Haynes, writer, classicist and sci-fi obsessive. She marked the 50th anniversary of Star Trek by watching the series, the whole thing, from start to finish.
And then all of Deep Space Nine.
So a sci-fi geek.
Yeah, we are a house with not one but two replica phases. So yes, a little bit of a geek.
She's going to take us back to the very beginning of the search for alien life, 2,000 years ago. Because long before there were observatories or space shuttles, the search began in our imaginations. One of the earliest recorded alien stories was written by a man called Lucian in the 2nd century.
He writes this extraordinary piece called The True Histories, in which these travellers tell the true story of how they travel by whirlwind to the moon. And it takes about a week, which is, I think, roughly, it's just over twice as long as it would take to get there by conventional rocket now.
So he gets to the moon, and what happens there?
He gets to the moon, and it's a war. It's a war to the death between the King of the Sun and the King of the Moon, and many and strange forces are ranged against each other.
And what descriptions did he give of the people that they encountered on the moon?
I hear you say people, but I think what you'd like to say is crazed alien species, because of course that's what we get. There are some salad-winged horses, and there are vultures and fleas that are the size of 12 elephants. So if you think of the tropes of science fiction, which involve space travel, almost always some intergalactic war, alien species which are sort of quasi-recognisable, but at the same time strangely monstrous. Tick, tick, tick and tick, Lucian is your man.
It would be satisfying if we could say that Lucian's story spawned a whole series of other alien stories, but it didn't. In fact, it wasn't until 800 years later that the next well-known sci-fi story was written down, this time in 10th century Japan. It was called The Bamboo Cutter's Daughter.
The story is that a bamboo cutter is chopping bamboo and he sees this strange kind of glowing stalk, and inside it is this tiny, perfect girl child. So he takes her home to be his daughter, and she grows up and she's very beautiful. And then, of course, word of her beauty gets out, and then eventually she confesses that she can't marry because she is not of here, and she looks up at the moon and weeps, and she returns to it.
And is it always the moon that people seem to write about when it comes to extraterrestrial life?
It was for a really long time, and I suppose that's because it was quite easy to see, and it is just much harder to see Venus or Mars with the naked eye.
But Mars would soon have its big moment. In 1877, an Italian astronomer looked through the telescope at Mars and for the first time examined it in detail.
He sees these sort of channels on the surface, and he calls them canali, which, of course, people in Britain go, "Oh, canals! There are canals on Mars. There must be Martians who dug the canals." So, of course, the public imagination was fired up.
4 years later, a London newspaper published a spoof article about a Martian invasion. A few years after that, a Polish priest wrote a story about 9-foot-tall vegetarians on the planet Mars, and he called them Martians, the first time that word had ever been used. Then there were reports of people seeing flashes of light coming from the red planet, bringing us to this, one of the most famous moments in broadcast history.
I'm speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building New York City, the bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as Martians approach.
That was a radio adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel The War of the Worlds. Narrated by the actor Orson Welles, it was presented as a series of news bulletins, telling people about a real, live alien invasion by Martians. And many of those listening to it back in 1938 believed it.
The whole field's covered by the woods, the bars, the gas tanks for the automobiles spreading everywhere, coming this way now.
And so our obsession with space and what life might be in it grew. Advances in space technology spawned films and books, and those films and books in turn fired the imaginations of young scientists who would, one day, become pioneers in the search for extraterrestrial life. Scientists like our next expert witness.
Part 2. The Search Begins.
It was 3 a.m, and the telescopes were grinding away. In my early 20s, there are coyotes outside the window. I can hear them howling, and I'm just hoping that the receivers don't break so that I have to go out there and fight them off with a flashlight so I can fix the receivers.
That's astronomer Seth Shostak, remembering a night in 1968 when he was in the Sierra Nevada mountains, finishing his astronomy PhD. He'd been pointing a radio antenna at the stars to learn more about the galaxy.
And I think, what the heck? And I just look up the positions of a couple of nearby stars, and I aim the antenna at those, thinking that, well, if I don't find anything, nobody needs to know that I even tried this. But if I do find something, well, I can go to Stockholm and collect a prize.
This was the dawn of the search for extraterrestrial life. It had all begun just 8 years earlier with a young astronomer called Frank Drake, an astronomer who'd had an idea. He'd worked out that using the kind of radio technology developed during the war, you could send signals from one star system to another. And, given how easy that was, it wasn't a stretch to think that extraterrestrial beings could be doing this already. We just needed to tune in to their signals. And that's what Frank Drake decided to do.
What Frank did is he used an existing antenna, the observatory there in West Virginia, and pointed it at a couple of nearby stars. And he hoped to kind of eavesdrop on signals they might be sending.
And what happened? Did he hear anything?
Well, he did hear something, actually. That's the funny thing about this. He looked at 2 nearby stars. And one star, it was just dead quiet. But the other one was not so quiet. Suddenly he got this very loud thumping sound, and he thought, my gosh, that was easy. I've already found the aliens. But it turned out he hadn't found the aliens. Most likely it was a military aircraft with some radar on board.
Soon, astronomers all over the world were searching for signs of alien life, mostly in their spare time. But then, things started to get serious. In the mid-80s, the US government funded a new institute called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and Seth Shostak started working there. The hunt for alien life was now no longer a hobby. It was a profession. Day in, day out, they would search for alien life using radio waves, listening for signs of life.
The tagline for the movie Alien was, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Well, that's true. Ordinary sound doesn't do so well in space because there's no air in space to speak of, but radio waves go right through space. If you aimed your radio receiver at a quasar or a pulsar or anything like that, what you would hear would be what's called white noise. It's just a psh. And for a pulsar, it would go on and off. Psh, 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 psh. Not very interesting. You'd get bored listening to that. The kind of signal we're looking for is even simpler than that.
It would sound a bit like this, he says. This isn't an actual recording of an alien signal, obviously, but it's a simulation made by Seth Shostak of the kinds of sounds that he and other astronomers are listening out for.
It would sound like somebody playing a flute standing next to Niagara Falls. The Niagara Falls is all the noise in the receiver and the background noise of space, but the transmitter would make a noise at one spot on the dial, which would sound like a tone, more like a pure note.
So they hunted for that flute noise, that pure note. The problem was, there were a lot of places to look. Billions of radio frequencies. So how do you decide which one to tune into?
Well, that's a real problem. You could say, well, I don't know. The aliens never sent me a text message or anything about where to tune, so I'll just sit here and twirl the dial. But you don't want to do that, because if you do that, you're spending all your time listening to the wrong frequency. What you want is a receiver that listens to all channels at once.
And by the 90s, that's what they had. Computers that could listen to millions of frequencies at the same time. And there've been some exciting moments, like the time when a volunteer astronomer at Ohio University was looking through data that had come through the university's radio telescope. As he looked through the numbers, he spotted signals of such intensity and frequency that he thought he might have found signs of life.
And he was so impressed, he wrote, "Wow," next to it.
And what was the signal? What had he found?
Well, the facts are we don't know. But many people have looked again in the same part of the sky that the wow signal seemed to be coming from, trying to find it again, and never have. So only two possibilities. Maybe it was ET, or it was just interference from something here on Earth.
That signal is still seen by many as the best candidate for an alien transmission ever received. And that's the closest we've got. In all the years of searching, there'd been no confirmed signals from alien life. And so questions began to be asked. Should governments really be spending millions of dollars searching for alien life when they might never find it? The answer soon came. In the early 90s, the SETI Institute lost its government funding.
I went home that night. My neighbor was standing in his driveway washing his car, and he said, "Well, Seth, you seem to be out of a job today."
The search for extraterrestrial life had lost its momentum, but a series of discoveries was about to fire things up again.
Part 3. Kepler.
One of my earliest vivid memories is seeing the astronauts land on the moon when I was in the 4th grade, and that was just unbelievably exciting, and I think that set the direction for my life.
That's David Grinspoon, an astrobiologist and advisor to NASA on space exploration. He's also a musician. You're listening to one of his space-inspired compositions. He's going to pick up the story of the search for alien life in the late 80s. Back then, one of the other reasons scientists doubted the existence of alien life was that there didn't seem to be many other planets out there.
As far as we knew, we lived in this really unusual part of the universe, and we could be the only life there is because there may not be any other planets. That was quite plausible, consistent with everything we know, until very recently.
But in the early 90s, astronomers started finding smaller planets, dwarf planets in our own solar system, in a little pocket beyond Pluto. It begged the question, were there also planets outside our own solar system? Planets like ours that could sustain life?
T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, engine start, 1, 0, and liftoff of the Delta II rocket with Kepler on a search for planets in some way like our own.
In March 2009, a NASA spacecraft, Kepler, was launched into space. It was an observatory with a telescope designed to search for other Earth-like planets outside our solar system.
Vehicles now going supersonic.
So Kepler was a very clever idea. You know, imagine holding your fist at arm's length and picture the amount of sky that blocks.
In that fistful of sky, there's thousands of stars. And what the Kepler spacecraft did was to stare at all the stars in that spot using a special telescope for several years, watching to see if the light coming from those stars flickered.
And if the light of a star flickers, it might be because something is passing between us and that star.
And that something is probably a planet.
You just look at the stars and see if they're basically twinkling in any kind of a rhythmic pattern. And that rhythmic pattern tells you, oh, there's something orbiting that star.
It's almost like Morse code from space.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's very much like that.
They expected to find some planets. What surprised them was just how many they found. 40 billion.
And it's probably more than that, because the average star probably has multiple planets, it seems.
And of that huge number, do we have any idea how many of them are habitable?
Well, we have rough estimates for the number of habitable planets because we don't really know what makes a planet habitable because we only have one example of a planet with life. But if we make some assumptions that a planet has to be roughly the size of the Earth and roughly within a certain climate zone, then we arrive at numbers like maybe 20 billion to 50 billion habitable planets in our own galaxy.
So in the space of just a few decades, we've learned that there aren't just a handful of planets in the universe, but billions, and many of those can support life. David Grinspoon describes it as a revolution in knowledge, one that's changed the way that many astronomers think about the likelihood of intelligent life.
Most astronomers, most planetary scientists, most astrobiologists will tell you, yeah, we're pretty darn sure there's life elsewhere because there's nothing we've learned about Earth that is unique in a way that allows life to exist here that should not allow it to exist elsewhere. And there's so many places now where this sort of experiment of nature putting together the right ingredients could have happened that the probability is overwhelmingly positive that there must be life elsewhere. That is the consensus opinion.
And there have been other important breakthroughs too. On our own planet, the discovery of extremophiles, organisms that can live in boiling hot springs or deep underground, has shown that you can have life in inhospitable places. And scientists now know that the kinds of organic molecules that you find here on Earth, the building blocks of life, exist throughout the universe. Put together, these discoveries have sparked new interest in the search for alien life. It raises a final question. If we do find signs of life, what then?
Part 4. The Day After.
My name is Stephen Dick, and I'm an astronomer and an historian of science. Have worked in both fields, culminating in my role as the NASA chief historian here in Washington, D.C.
And as I understand it, when you left NASA, they named an asteroid after you. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Asteroid 6544 Stephen Dick. It's in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter.
Like many astronomers, Stephen Dick thinks it likely that there is life out there. What concerns him is what happens if and when we find it.
There's certainly no systematic program in the U.S. government or any other government that I know of to prepare for the impact of discovering life.
And he should know, because for a few years, Stephen Dick was the Alien Life Preparation Program. He was funded by NASA to look at the impact of making contact with alien life. And what he discovered is that there are some protocols in place. For example, instructions on how not to contaminate Earth with any samples brought back from other planets. But
those are very short term. They don't tell you what to do in the medium to longer term.
Of course, the first question on all of our minds, whether or not we're sci-fi geeks, is whether, when that moment of first contact happens, we'd be instantly obliterated.
Well, that's right. We can't take it for granted that aliens are going to be good. Even at the microbial level, there's the famous scenario where bacteria comes from outer space and infects the Earth. But also, we don't know whether the extraterrestrials are going to be good or bad. We've evolved altruism on the Earth. So would altruism have evolved in outer space? Would they be altruistic or not?
Is there a particular scenario that worries you?
Well, of course, the scenario that you hear about most in science fiction, and the one that would have the most impact, would be a direct contact if they actually land on Earth. That would be worrisome from the point of view that we have very little time to react, which is another reason to prepare for a direct contact like that.
And do you think that scenario is possible, that some kind of intelligent life could turn up unannounced, that we wouldn't see it coming?
It's certainly logically possible that extraterrestrials could arrive on the Earth with little warning, sure.
But it's certainly the least likely of all the different scenarios. What's far more plausible is that we'll make contact with some kind of alien life that exists thousands of light years away. And then we'd have more basic problems to work out, like how would we communicate with them?
Well, this is a subject of a lot of discussion. The movie Arrival showed this, I thought, in a very compelling way.
You hear any words?
You have a non-anthropoid intelligence, actually a heptapod, and they're trying to communicate.
It's their language. We need to talk to them.
It's more complicated than that.
How is it more complicated?
What does it say?
What you're doing is looking for something that would be universal. And so the first thing a lot of people think about is that you would talk in terms of mathematics. But there are different theories about that too. There's the idea that mathematics is discovered, and then there's the idea that mathematics is invented. So it really goes into some very interesting age-old philosophical questions.
There are even more esoteric questions to consider too, he says. If we did discover alien life, what effect would that have on religion? A few years ago, Stephen Dick was at a meeting where this very issue was discussed. A Jesuit from the Vatican Observatory was there, and he had this question for the group.
His question was, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? And his answer was that only if it asked.
There would be ethical issues too. How should we treat aliens? What should their moral status be? Then there's the question of who should speak for the world. The UN? Bono? So what are the answers? Well, no one has them yet. But Stephen Dick's point is that we should bring astronomers, philosophers, anthropologists and politicians together to at least start talking about these problems.
It's always better to have a plan, I think. The plan doesn't always work, but it's better to have these things thought out ahead of time.
So, is there anyone out there? Well, as we've heard, so far we've found no hard evidence of alien life. In all the decades of searching, nothing. But there's another way to look at it, as a question of probability. With over 40 billion planets in our galaxy alone, it seems unlikely that we're the only planet to have evolved life. So yes, there probably is life out there, but will we ever find it? Maybe. Or will it find us first? This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Helena Merriman, and produced by Sarah Shebbear and Charlotte Pritchard. It was mixed by James Beard, and our editor is Richard Knight. Next week, we're coming back down to earth and looking at Guantanamo Bay.